We can begin. My name is Roy Henson. I'm a retired school teacher. With me is Dale Watson. We're long-term friends from church. We share a pulpit. I do Fifth Sunday and he does more, but I'm 82. He's a little bit younger, by the way. I spent 15 years volunteering in Cades Cove. I'm a pioneer toy maker, and he's a cabinet maker and sometimes blacksmith too. But we've enjoyed meeting people here and people that know people I know, which is really good. We're going to be looking at preservation of food. In the beginning of the settlement here, I'm familiar with Cades Cove. The first settlement as you go in was a couple settled there in 1818 with a baby. They were able to make a small cabin with a fireplace, but come about February, March, food got scarce, and the Cherokee Indian brought dried pumpkin. And 15 years later, what did we do? We sent them all packing to Oklahoma. But they were loving and they preserved life for the baby. And with pumpkin, you could make baby food. It's nutritious, and they survived that first hard time. My granddaughter made this video. My grandson improved it, and I blanked it, so I'm going back with hers. They didn't have canning jars in 1840. But they did have hand tools. And some of you old enough to see this at museums and places. I've used some of those myself. I followed a mule across the field a lot when I was young. And we know this, people come to the mountains to see just this. Okay, and this. There was a story about rail fences. They had to be mule high and pig tight. So if you watch they're closer together at the ground level and further apart at the top, pigs were kept in and the horses, you had to be taller for them. And they've spent a lot of money replacing those in the park. Okay, here's some of the things we're going to look at. We're going to look at the things they preserved. We're going to talk about fermentation, drying, processing, and salting and smoking. And those are the things we're going to look at. And you see the rest of those that I can't see, okay? Okay, beginning with corn. One of the most important crops was corn. Now what they're picking here is probably field corn, and yellow corn was used to feed the pigs, the cows, the sheep, turkeys and geese and ducks, and white corn was made into cornmeal for people. I have in my bag here toys made out of the corn shuck, and you know what the hair is made out of? Corn silk. I'll show you at the end of the class, okay? So this, and when I was youngster, I took the down row. If you're not a farmer, the down row is a mule wagon went straddling one row. The big people picked on the sides, and we kids, Mom said, you're closer to the ground, you get the down row. It was knocked down with a wagon, and that was my job to pick it up, pitch it in a mule wagon. You know how we break that wagon going down the hill? You lock a chain around the wheel so it wouldn't run over the mules going downhill. Okay, another thing they made with corn was hominy. How many of you had hominy? It's not really popular at the store, but they would use lye. Where we'd get the lye, they'd run water through the ashes from the fireplace, and oak wood produces a form of lye. And they could take the husk off, and then the corn expands, not quite like popcorn, but it expands and makes a very good, it's not very tasty, but it's doable. Kraut, one of the most important foods in the mountain, and I love it as well. You would take shredded cabbage, and they'd had large crock containers nearly as big as that trash can, because the average family size was from 6 to 10 children. And when the garden was gone and the fresh food was gone, kraut was a good approximation, and you can eat it with a lot of different things, okay? You put a layer of cabbage, a layer of salt, a layer of cabbage. About 10 or 15 days down the way, you've got sauerkraut. You store it by putting a plate on top and submerging it so the liquid comes across the top. It may darken a bit, but you can have kraut next spring and summer. The big meat supply was pork. Now we show a pig in their typical thing in their wallow, and my granddaughter thought this was funny. She didn't get good pictures of butchering because country butchering, you hung it up on a pole, 3 or 4 people lifting it up, and you butchered it that way, and this way. So let's think about this. You took the pork, you first butchered it, you put it in a scalded pan and scraped off the hair, then hung and disemboweled it, did the hams and shoulders, and then down in Cage Cove you find a smokehouse. What are those buildings for? Inside you would have a salt box and a layer of salt, and then you put the hams and the shoulders on top and pour it. It'd take 25 pounds of salt to salt down some hogs like this. You had to have it and to preserve it. All right, then it was preserved, and they didn't have these stainless steel pans, okay? But they did have chestnuts by the truckload. Now, if you had a herd of pigs and you needed enough for the winter, you would send them off in the woods, and what would they feed on? Beech mast, acorns, chestnuts. I don't think there's anybody in this room living when the last chestnut were died. The disease hit about 1920, and the killed almost all of them off. So the Chinese chestnuts are much bigger, not as good, but some of those trees were 12 feet in diameter, big as redwoods in these woods here. They're all gone. All right, hickory nuts. I introduced Dale to hickory nuts yesterday. The first time, how old are you? His first time in his life, he tasted the sweet taste of a shellbark hickory nut. If you need a half of a cup to make a cake, in about 3 hours' time, you could probably accumulate enough to get your half cup. We also cracked hard black walnuts. They're a little harder. Just think how much effort the squirrel puts in those little teeth. And he doesn't leave a single bit in that shell. Okay, we use toothpicks to get them out today. The shell bark, if you probably can't see it, but the shell bark, the bark hangs out in big strips. And if you're familiar with the state nursery, you can get 3 or 4 kinds of shell bark hickory. The large nuts are the best ones, and some are even softer than that. Okay, let's go here. They got a lot of wild fruit. Any of y'all ever pick a pawpaw? Okay, picking up pawpaws, putting them in the, okay, you know the song. My dad transferred those from the creek bank to his backyard, and they reproduce, and we mow them down with a lawnmower. But pawpaws are good food once a year. I was teaching in the school in Smyrna, took some of that, and one boy loved them, and he'd go get one out of the fridge each day, and no one would smell them but him. He wanted a pawpaw, and I said, help yourself. Once a year is just fine for me. You can dry almost any kind of fruit. The predominant was apples, and we're going to talk about that in depth. And if you come to the class tomorrow morning, we'll let you sample some of those. You can dry berries, probably if you had to split them open so they will dry properly. And you have the approximation of a blackberry cobbler for Christmas. Otherwise, they are long gone. Now, later when we had cans around, my mama in my youth would put up 600 quarts of processed food. Blackberries, peaches, beets, all sorts of stuff. I think these are peaches. My granddaughter, who's 30, didn't have the same concept of old type stuff. I think that, and you could dry peaches as well. You might have to split them several times and take a long time to get them dry. Now, these are purple hulled. Among the many kinds, there are Crowder peas, whippoorwill peas, field peas. A little off the subject. This guy said he had eaten so many peas he didn't ever want you get the story, okay. We have in Clay County a road called Pea Ridge. I think they lived on peas. But they could dry these, then shell them, store them in crocks, and have them during the winter when food was scarce. They dried beans as well. My wife thought it was funny. I hang peppers on our lamp on the back side in the living room where she couldn't see. I dry my peppers in the living room hanging on the floor lamp. I did. And they're in the other room for the storage. And we also dried, let's see what they called, you dried beans, and they call them because they look like old pants. What do you call them? Leather britches beans. They make an approximation of fresh beans, most in your mind. If you put enough pork fat, they were edible because in March you didn't have fresh food. Who knows what creasy salad is? About the earliest food you can get in the spring, creasy forms down in the spring, and you can get creasy salad before poke salad even comes in, and before you get turnips. Okay. Now, we did this in class, and we did a competition who can make the longest peel. Some of them got that long, and today 2 of them fought for a prize for that long. You turn the apple and hold the knife, okay? Now, they weren't wearing shorts back in the mountains, but this is the approximation of making apple butter. So you preserve the things you had for the times that you didn't have it. If you've gone through Oconee Lefty in the fall before the COVID came along, they would demonstrate these skills. And my wife took pictures of some of these, and you stir it constantly. What happens if it sticks to the bottom? It's ruined. The whole pot is ruined. You don't. And so they did this at Sugarlands. When they got through, I would put my finger against that skillet. It was really good, what was left over. Finger licking, by the way. Okay, dried apples. If you've never had a fried apple pie, you've missed a good part of a good life, man. In our church, just before Dale got there, this lady, Sister Phillips, would bring for a church dinner about 25 fried pies, and every person to them would go there and get the pie first. Why? Before they were all gone. Then they'd go get the meat dishes and the casseroles. Fortunately, sometimes she would always stuck 6 in the seat of my car, and I said, thank you. They were really good. Her daughter doesn't even know how, and I've asked her to cook those pies. Now, again, my granddaughter couldn't imagine the fact that in 1840 you didn't have jars. This is called apple cider vinegar. Now, if you wanted to pickle your pickles and other fruits, you would first get the apple cider, let it ferment one time, which gives about 3 or 4% alcohol. Ferment the second time, you get about 5% acidity for vinegar, so that they could make their own preservation vinegar from the apple cider.
Where did they make it at if they didn't have the jars yet? Where did
They would had crockery. We've got a small one down there, but mostly with crock jars. And once it was fermented, it would preserve it. And the same is true with apple cider, called hard cider. If it's got a little bit of alcohol, it'll store. I've seen a few movies where they put aside a whole barrel of it. You know, the alcohol would preserve it. But this you would not guarantee the acidity. It wouldn't be 5% acidity. It might be 3, it might be 7, but it would make your pickles. They also fermented pickles as well as kraut, call them salt pickles. All right, if you're cooking up apples, they wouldn't have had all the metal jars, but you could cook them up to make a lot of apple pies. You could cook in a wash kettle to make apple butter. I think I went one by. What we did, we let them peel an apple in the class and then put one on the crank peeler, which came along about the time of the Civil War. And the crank peeler made peels as long as that, which they couldn't count. And the short ones by hand. I don't guess you could imagine, in my childhood, back in the early 50s, a local fellow would go to South Carolina and bring a truckload of peaches in. We would take a corn scoop, put them in our baskets, and we'd peel peaches for a week, the ripest ones first. If he was coming back, she'd get 3 bushel, and she'd get 5 bushel. I've peeled a lot of fruit. And good. All right, this is a crock of the size you would put kraut and beans. This was made when I could got one of these in Salina, and I couldn't pick it up, so I took pictures. These crocks were all sizes from 10 gallon to 20 or 30, and if you're feeding 10 or 15 kids in a family or neighbors or grandma, you would have probably had 10 gallons of kraut. When you wanted to get some, you take the plate off, get out of the bowl, put the plate back, and weight it down so that it's preserved. Late in the season, it might be darkened, but perfectly good to use, okay? The crocks, they would hardly turn over. That was safe. And they would hold a lot and waterproof, and you could seal them up and keep out the bugs and all those kind of things. Now, if you have not had sorghum molasses in your lifetime, you'll have to come to tomorrow morning's class, because we're going to give you a sample made by the Mennonites just north of Salina. There's a big settlement there. And you take sorghum cane, and if you've seen pictures, the horses go in a circle to grind out the juice. It's collected and boiled down in pans such as this. It's a shame you get diabetes, isn't it? When you just can't enjoy the better things of life. How about that? But they make this at the Mennonites, and last fall I went and bought $100 worth. Here's why. My daughter makes gingerbread houses. So she got most of it to make the sides for the gingerbread houses. And we make gingerbread, and you can really do a biscuit right. Now, this would be called a spring house. Now, if you go all these mountain places, they didn't have any wells. What did they have? You would locate your house near a spring for fresh water. But if you wanted to keep the bugs and animals out, you'd build a house over it, and then you could take your butter and your milk and store in the spring house. In the summer, it'd be cool enough, and in the winter, it'd be warm enough for the water. And you could store, and you might have stored apples as well in there. So a spring house was worth a lot. If you drive through the mountains where they preserve Cage Cove, you'll see spring houses and root cellars and smoke houses preserved there in the mountains, okay? This is an approximation of a root cellar. They would dig it probably under the east or south side of the house so they could put bushels of potatoes, bushels of apples, pumpkins, turnips, and keep them for an extended time fresh in those root cellars. In the spring, what will potatoes almost always do? Sprout. Now, we showed them this morning, if you were running short on potatoes and you need seed potatoes and food potatoes, you could take a sprout, a section like this, and still eat the potato. So people had to be innovative and careful, and we're going to talk a lot about the timing. All right. And one of the most important things was a grist mill such as this, powered by a water wheel. They preserved 2 in the Smokies, one at Mingus Mill on the Carolina side and one at Cades Cove. And the water power provides the turning, and the millstones, have you all seen them at places about this big around? What does the Bible say? If you think something bad, put a millstone around his neck, and he won't come up, because they weigh about 500 pounds. In the mills, one stone is at the bottom and stationary. The top wheel turns, and you adjust the courses of your mill by the spacing of the stones. It's important. If the stones touch, what happens? You burn the stone, they get hot, you completely ruin them. Now, my dad ran a grist mill in the early 50s. Here's why. The Green family had 10 kids. The Crawford family had 10 kids. And these folks depended on cornbread 3 meals a day. What's a tern? Anybody? A sack of corn behind your back on a horse. And you'd ride it to mill, and that's called a tern. Bushel, a bushel and a half. Well, those large families would bring meal almost every week or two because they were feeding 10 or 12 people a lot of cornbread. It makes great Christmas dressing too, of course. If you want to see these meals, you can go inside and see the gears, and every so often they have to rebuild the water wheels because they rot. Okay, now I'm going to go back and look at some of these. If you have questions now, because we want you to offer suggestions or questions about what your life, because I'm 82 and I've lived through some of these. Actually, I went to college. Mom and Dad still had an outhouse. We did have electricity, but the first year of that house, we didn't have electricity either. So we took our water, our milk down to the spring and used it. If it was going to rain, what'd you have to do? Bring it to the house, it'd float down the creek. You'd lose it. But it would keep your butter and milk in spring ice like this. So those things, and we're trying to share a bit of the culture. I'm afraid our younger people are more concerned about technology. This is pretty good technology too. These guys who chip, I had a great grandfather that could sharpen a millstone, used a hammer. You would retool those grooves so that it would make the meal and feed off, and it would feed out in the bin in the front. My dad was a miller. My mama said, I got everybody's meal. See, he'd get a toll. What does that mean? He got 1/7 of the meal as a toll. Mama's was all those tolls combined. She had to have a really good sifter to get stabilized meal like this. Any comments from you all? Because we're going to look at some of these. Anybody? Okay, large families. I went to school at a little school called Mount Vernon. There were 3 teachers. Grades 1 and 2 was 1 teacher, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, 7, and 8. One of those families birthed 18 children, 4 sets of twins. There was more than one time that those poor kids were begging food from people because they just didn't have enough to go around. In fact, one story was, if you stumbled on the way to the dinner plate, you just turned left. By the time you got there, it was all gone. Not quite the truth, but they did have a hard time. So we're talking about without technology such as we have it, without stores, they would have had peddlers. What's a peddler? Anybody know what that is?
Salesman.
Okay, and the peddler would have come around. In this case, it might have been on the horse. He had brought with him salt and sugar and a few supplies. A lot of time he would take orders and come back next time with those other orders. And then later on, they would come from Maryville with a wagon. They could bring more stuff and even shoes and bolts of fabric. In Cage Cove, I think there was a school and 3 stores and 3 churches and 680 people in that one community. Its maximum number of people there. They lived well in the cove. Now, about the kinds of food preservation. Natural preservation would involve making kraut, which is what? What's the process? Fermentation. And you would have to judge that. You know, it's not an exact science. It partly depends on the color and the smell. And you would keep the liquid over the top of it so it wouldn't damage. We made some, and my mother-in-law carried it all the way to New York, and they bragged it was the best they'd ever had. They might have been prejudiced, but she did carry it and share with her cousins who were all from Norway, by the way. Have you ever been to one of the mills and watched them milling? In the mountains, you'll see a little stream of meal falling out. Well, over at Mingus Mill on the other side, this was a joke. The guy says, we pay $12 a bushel for corn and sell it for $6. They buy it retail, they sell it for chicken feed. We bought it and we ate it. We knew it was good. But if you buy a meal at these stores, it's made at the mill here in Pigeon Forge under glass. So the mill that's sold at Mingus Mill or Cades Cove is not milled there. It's milled under glass at Pigeon Forge. Did you notice what's on the roof of this building?
Cedar shakes.
Okay, they're called shakes. They're more often would have been oak. And if you've never heard the expression, dull as a froe was a tool that you drove through to split off the shingles or the shakes to put on the roof. And they've torn down most of the buildings with metal roofs, and what have they kept? Which were typical about 1900. They backed it up to about that far. And they've kept the shingles. And it's amazing. I'm a toy maker, and I go through, and I said, what are you going to do with those? I picked up all their shakes and took them home and made toys out of them. They were going to burn them, but I helped them out. I didn't know how long this was going to take, but if you've got comments or stories about some of your family, all of my grandparents were born before 1900. And I'll tell young people about that. That's ancient history. But my granddad Burble was born in 87. My grandma in 95. My grandparents on this side 92 and 93. I was raised with old people sometimes. And we had a good life. And they had a good life. And these folks in the mountains, let me tell you about a little entertainment. If you are careful taking the shucks off of the corn, you can turn it into something like that. My wife does this, and she doesn't know I have these today, okay? And if you want different color hair, you've got to find some other corn, and you can choose to make that. And of course, they make females because it's very hard to make legs and feet on a doll. It's very easy to put a skirt. Okay. Now, my part was I took red dyes and colored like you do your clothing and dye the fibers. But the natural color of the corn, of course, is the part that she made the broom out of, like this. So you remember, they didn't have toys, but they made fun. Today we peeled apples and threw it over our shoulder. Now, I thought this was funny until I'd seen it one source, and then his wife said she heard it somewhere else. You would throw that peel over, and when it landed on the floor, it would probably make some shape of a letter. And if the girlfriend didn't claim the boyfriend, her friends did. And said, that's him, and it might be an O or a C or a D. It was, you guessed it was what, but it was fun to pitch over your shoulder and pick it up and see what shape it made on the floor. Let me put these aside because, sure enough, these belong on the mantle at the cabin, and she doesn't even know that I took them.
Wiley Oakley talks about a red ear of corn during the courting time. Do you
Uh-huh.
know about that?
Okay, red or white, it's called a corn husking. When you harvest corn, you harvest it with a shuck on. It helps it to dry better and store better. And when you want to get the shuck off, you could get free labor if there was a prize in there for that young guy to find that ear and get to kiss his girl of a choice, hopefully his girlfriend. But who got that red ear or that white ear, and that's what it was. So they husked the corn. He got it all shucked for free for the prize like that. Yeah, happy with him. They would call that husking. Take the shucks off. And you've heard the expression, all shucks. Suppose it started there. I'm going to close this down and honor questions from you or comments. Have you enjoyed the Wildlife Week? Did you enjoy it last year in Ramsey? It was so crowded, so crowded. This is an ideal venue. I'm also a toy maker. I did toys in this venue about 10 years ago. we made toys of spinning tops. One of the prizes for the appeal today was a spinning top. You ever seen a gourd that spins like that? That was the prize for the longest apple peel. It was sort of fun. And I told her if she couldn't spin it, she couldn't take it home, but she finally did. When we did toys at Cades Cove, we would offer a woman, if you could spin it, you can have it. Sometimes the husband cheated, says, honey, watch what he's doing. You must hold the gourd upside down like this, or it won't spin. And so it worked that way. We also, 3 or 4 things I wanted to get out, and when you don't plan properly, do you call them senior moments too? That's right. But what we did in our classes in the mornings, we're letting them shuck corn, shell it by hand, shell it in a corn sheller. And if you look at this corn sheller, the side of it has a big long circle. That handle is rubbed on that 1,000 times into the wood. You can see the scrapes where it's shelled. And then we peeled apples. We tasted molasses. I'm trying to think 4 things we did, and we're doing that again tomorrow. If you have questions, anybody? Yes.
What's the full process of making the 11 richest beans?
Okay, you would get your favorite kind of beans, hopefully late in the season. Get a big darning needle and a thread and string them up and give them about 6 weeks to air dry.
Any particular kind of bean?
Mostly what you had, I'd say stick beans are pretty common because that's one of the favorites. They're easy to pick because they're off the ground. The ones I dried were purchased at a store because that's when I could get them. But they called leather breeches because the appearance of old, and they're not very good, but they sure beat. You know what my grandfather called it? He said it's a lot better than north wind and rabbit tracks. That makes sense? A lot better than that. He said feeding the cattle. Okay.
Then how do you resuscitate?
Okay. Then you would literally soak those like you would pinto beans and soak them and then put a lot of flavoring of salt, pork, and salt to make them taste better than they really would. But it was a poor approximation of fresh beans is what it was. But they called it the rich. Yes, ma'am.
So you were talking about the root cellar earlier, you said into the south or the east part of the house?
Well,
What would be
there'd be some advantages of temperature control. A lot of times the most favorite part of a house is on the east side. You have less blowing rain to leak into the sun. Maybe in the winter you'd like it on the south because it would warm it up a little bit, warm the dirt up. I think it just depended on where it was. I don't think the side mattered terrifically, but the shelter part of it would help. Yes?
Just want to commend you and others that keep our history alive. Of course, you know the county I grew up in and worked, but you can lose this in one generation.
Well, see, our county came from your county.
Right.
Jackson County hived off Clay County in 1870.
You know, we can lose this knowledge in one generation. My older sister married young, moved to Nashville, raised her kids in Nashville, one of which during high school worked at Kroger's in the produce department. So he was in Jackson County at my brother's house, and David said, go out in the garden and get me some onions. So this is sort of late in the summer. And the kid came back, he said, I couldn't find any onions. David said, well, I've got a lot of them out there. We always raise a lot of onions. So David went with him. He pulled an onion up out of the ground, and Sean said, I've never seen an onion like that. Of course, it still had the stalk on it.
Yeah.
He said,
And the seed pod on top of it.
Exactly.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And he said, most of them are just what we sell are those little green ones.
Yeah.
Dave said, well, do you understand the process? If you left those in the ground, they would become one generation away.
Yeah.
And she grew up on the same farm.
Well, let's discuss the keeping of seeds. You didn't have hybridization of fruit trees or vegetables, but you didn't have GMO either. So we're showing a white corn, which is called Hickory King, and that would typically make your cornmeal. You had to keep your bean seeds, your sorghum cane seeds, broomcorn seeds, right? You had to keep all those things and keep the mice and rodents from getting into them. They were almost more important than tomorrow's meal because it was next year's meals. So they had to be really careful to maintain seed stock and enough of them. Like I said, from the potatoes, we showed them today that you could cut around and make it and preserve almost all the potato to eat as well as making a seed from it, which is not, it's a set like this. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Good.
What kind of time frame was it where they started being able to can beans in jars?
The Civil War had an awful lot to do with the processing. I think public canning, tin cans would have come along about 1870, 1880. Glass jars along about, Ball and them came along about then. At that time they were two-piece. You had a rubber seal and a zinc lid, and then they came across with those others. So we were saying we did ours prior to canning. So we had crockery, drying, all kind of preservation as much as they could. And late in the winter, they often had a restriction on what kind of food they had left, especially if you had to keep your seeds stuck. You couldn't eat all your potatoes up or eat all of your beans. You had to store those for, and a lot of times there's another baby by the time next year come along as well. Anybody here was out of a family more than 6 kids? Anybody? How many?
8.
Anybody?
My mother was pregnant with number 5 before number 1 was in school. She didn't start school again. She was 6 years old.
Well, I told my dad and uncle ran a farm together. There were 2 kids of us and 5 of theirs. Mom and Dad had easier preparing food because of fewer mouths to feed. It made an awful difference. It really does. And so family size was a lot of preparation. It really was. They fed their pigs in the woods. And if y'all have ever eaten beech mast, it's a triangular shaped seed in a little tiny burr like this. They're good and tasty, but you couldn't get fat eating beech nuts. But the availability of the nuts in the woods were plentiful. And so those great trees put off bushels and bushels. I've heard say some of the pigs would stand up to eat and lay down under that same tree and sleep and get up and start eating again. It's just like a grocery store. All those nuts, great supply. Yes, sir.
Speaking of the cellars, there's a story that Harvey Oakley tells about visiting his grandmother, who was Lucinda Ogle.
Yeah.
This is in the Bud Ogle cabin right outside Gatlinburg.
Yeah.
And for breakfast, she had a local cellar. She just lifted up floorboards right by the fireplace.
And reached under.
And pulled up whatever food was down there, potatoes, probably, or apples. And then for fresh eggs, she would open the shutter door, and she had
a nest on the side of the house.
Place for the hens.
Yeah.
So she'd just pick up a fresh egg and cook it right there in the fire.
Without going outside, yeah.
Right.
Keep in mind, a lot of those families might have had 100 chickens. They didn't need that many eggs, but needed that much meat. And you take a big family, you didn't kill 1 chicken, you had to kill 2, unless they were large. So the number of animals kept would be, and people asked me yesterday, why did they keep beef? Beef was harder because, first of all, you're talking about 800 or 900 pounds, and it's very, very hard to handle that, hard to process it. A pig pen could be 1/3 the size of this room, and a cow needed acres of grass. So you had grass for the milk cow, but you didn't have room for beef animals. So the pork provided so much more meat for the area that you had and for the way you could feed them. And they'll eat any kind of food scraps as well, just about.
One thing that my wife does, with her tomatoes at the end of the season for the frost.
Yeah.
She'll take them, wrap them in newspaper, put them in a dark spot in the house, cold place, and you'll eat fresh tomatoes for Christmas.
Christmas time. Yep. If you leave them on the vine. Yep, on the vine.
There's a story, I can't think of the term in it, but a really poor family, and I don't know if this is true or not. If they got a small piece of meat, they would hang it up over the table and look at it as a part of their meal, though they couldn't actually eat it. Do you know anything about that? Is that a false story or?
I think that was a come on, but my great-grandfather didn't go to church, but he cooked Christmas dinner, and my mama came there, she says, there was the chicken with the head on and the eyes, and says, we didn't want to eat. He left the head on and cooked it whole.
It's called torture.
Yeah, I guess so. But we have the conveniences of regular income. They did not. We have the convenience of food stores and specialty stores, clothing stores. They did not. You can't imagine the amount of hand down on clothing and shoes from families. And it was good that there were a bunch of girls in sequence because you wouldn't want to show the boys' clothes. But they did. And what happened to the tattered clothing? Quilt. Made quilts. Cut quilt pieces. They didn't waste very much. Not very much.
Was fruits a name for apples in general?
It was the predominant fruit because they'd have so many. There are 4,000 kinds of apples. If you've been to Cosby, the big orchard up near Newport, they have pictures on their wall of about 100 varieties that they used to grow. And they tell you when they ripen. Beginning late June apples, all the way to the Arkansas black ripening in late October. When I was about 10, one of my grandfather's back fields had a big fence row and tall grass. In that fence row was a Arkansas black tree. Those apples ripened usually in late October. They'd fall off on the ground and be insulated with that grass, and we sometimes go at Christmas and find at least half an apple. Someone might eat half it already, but it had been preserved by the ground temperature and the grass because and so a good part of preservation was growing stuff right there. You didn't want to store potatoes that you finished in June. You wanted your potatoes to finish in September. They would keep better. You didn't want to store June apples in June. You want to store apples that ripen late in the year. And the same is true with your beans and corn. It was easy to preserve it if you timed it close to the time you wanted to keep it and the length of time you had to keep it. Yes, ma'am.
You're talking about Carver's Orchard. I love going out there and seeing their apples and when they come in throughout
Yeah.
the year. I was talking to them about how they preserve, and they basically keep them almost a year.
Uh-huh.
She was like, what we have out is from
Goes
how
right.
many months ago because
And just 2 degrees above freezing.
yes, like it's exactly.
And when you take them out, they won't keep very long.
Right, and he said he goes in periodically and will look. I mean, you don't bump them around and smash
Yeah,
them and everything.
yeah.
He will turn them over gently and see if there's any bad spots or anything
Yeah.
starting, and he'll pull that apple.
Yeah.
Because it'll. I guess
You know, they say one in each barrel will.
That apple.
Yep, that's exactly
But
right.
she said that these apples have been here for months and months and months. The ones that are out because of the way they preserve them in the back.
Yeah.
I was like, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
That they would hold that long.
Good apple pies too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good apple pies, absolutely.
But their apple pies are not like grandma's because they use fresh apples, and you want the dried apples and season with cinnamon to get a really good pie. Good pie.
So apple stack cake.
Yeah. Stack cakes. Yeah. Yes.
So apple stack cake was so predominant because they had so many apples.
Yeah, they'd had a good orchard because they knew they could process them in so many ways. But we've got dried apples. I've had dried for 3 years. They'll keep. They're darker, but if you keep them in a dark, cool storage. Now, sometimes you find worms. You know what the old timers did? You wash off the worms and cook the apples. You couldn't afford to lose it, But you could clean them up, literally clean them up and wash them off and cook the apples, and they're pretty good if you didn't tell them what you're cooking.
I remember my grandmother telling my father he was planting the peas in the wrong sign.
Uh-huh.
And she said, you'll have a lot of vines and no peas. Well, at the end of the growing season, he had a lot of vines, and I think they got 3 or 4 peas off of 4 or 5 rows. Because
Yeah,
it's the
wrong sign. My mother was born in 1918. She was number 3 out of 6. She says when she was almost too young, her dad hooked the ground sled to the mule. The big kids walked and they rode the sled to the field to pick peas by the bushels, hauled them into the yard and let them dry if it wasn't going to rain, and shell peas till they were tired of peas. But it was something to eat. And you got to keep, all those bean dishes can be flavored with bacon and ham, and you make a bad bean taste really good if you give it to the right moniker. Yep. Thanks for coming.